The cold was a physical presence in Simferopol that December. A damp, metallic chill that seeped through coats and into bones. It was not yet noon, but the gray light made it feel like perpetual twilight. 15-year-old David moved quickly, head down, the worn violin case clutched to his chest like a shield. The lesson with Professor Rosen had been a fragile pocket of normalcy, 40 minutes where only Mozart existed. Now, reality reasserted itself with every hollow echo of his own footsteps on the deserted side street. He replayed the final bars of the concerto in his head, a private mantra against the silence. They emerged from a brick archway so suddenly, they seemed part of the city's grim new architecture. Two men in the dark uniforms of the local auxiliary police. Their faces were familiar in the way all local faces were familiar, but now transformed by authority and cheap wool. They blocked his path. The taller one, with a thin mustache, gestured with a baton. No words at first. David stopped, his heart a frantic drum against the violin case. He knew the drill. He fumbled for his internal passport, the pages now stamped with the damning letter. The policeman took it, glanced, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread. David Abramovich, he read the name aloud, giving it a theatrical weight. He looked from the document to the boy's face. In a hurry? Carrying something valuable? The other, younger, with cold eyes, reached out and tapped the violin case with his gloved finger. Open it. A bolt of pure terror shot through David. This was different from a document check. The case was an extension of himself, its scuffed leather holding his only escape. His fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled with the latches. The clicks were deafening in the quiet street. He opened the lid, revealing the instrument nestled in faded blue velvet. The rich honey-colored wood of the violin glowed softly in the dull light. The policeman with the mustache whistled low. He didn't ask. He simply lifted the violin from its bed. He held it by the neck, not like a musician, but like a club, examining it with a false curiosity. Nice, very nice. Where'd a Jewish boy get a thing like this? Steal it? It was my grandfather's, David whispered, the words sticking in his dry throat. I study at the music school. Music school, the man repeated, exchanging a glance with his partner. The younger one reached into the deep pocket of his greatcoat. He pulled out not a weapon, but a small battered can and a thick brush. He pried the lid open. The smell of cheap, oily black paint cut through the cold air. Understanding dawned on David a second before the act. A sound escaped him, a choked protest that wasn't a word. The first policeman held the violin steady, horizontal, like an offering. The second dipped the brush, loaded it with a dripping glob of black, and brought it down onto the instrument's belly. The brush moved with brutal workmanlike efficiency. It wasn't a star. It was a crude, ugly parody. Two overlapping triangles forming a haphazard, dripping hexagon. The paint defiled the delicate varnish, soaked into the spruce, a violent stain on the resonance chamber that once held only music. Each stroke was a violation. The sound of the bristles scraping against the wood was worse than a shout. David stood paralyzed, his vision tunneled, focusing on the spreading blackness, on the droplet of paint that gathered and fell, landing on the policeman's boot. Time distended. This wasn't about the order, the registration. This was something more intimate, more sadistic. They weren't just marking a person. They were erasing a soul, proving that nothing beautiful or personal was sacred. The violin was his voice, his future, his tether to a world that made sense. They were murdering it in front of him. The painter stepped back, examining his work with a critic's squint. The holder shoved the violin, now sticky and reeking, back into the case. The painted star smeared against the velvet lining. "There," the mustached one said, handing David his documents. "Now it's properly identified. Don't forget. Tomorrow, 10 in the morning at the square. All your things. You don't want to be late." They walked away, their laughter a short, sharp burst that echoed off the walls before the silence swallowed it again. David remained. He looked down into the case. The black mark seemed to pulse, a wound. He slowly, mechanically, closed the lid. The latches sounded final. He stood there for a full minute, the cold now registering as a deep internal shiver. He turned and began to walk, then run, the case banging against his leg, the weight of it now entirely different. He burst into the apartment, slamming the door behind him. His mother, Anna, was mending a sheet in the weak light from the window. She took one look at his ashen face, at the way he clutched the case to his stomach, and her needle froze. "David?" He couldn't speak. He walked to the table, placed the case down, and opened it. The smell of paint filled the small room. Anna stood, the fabric falling from her hands. She approached as one would approach a corpse. She stared at the defiled instrument. Her hand rose to her mouth, not in shock, but to stifle a wave of nauseous understanding. This was a message clearer than any printed decree. When Jacob, her husband, returned from a secret, risky house call, he found them like that, silently staring at the open case. He removed his hat, his shoulders sagging under his worn coat. He saw the violin. He was a diagnostician. He saw the symptom and immediately understood the disease. They did this on the street? His voice was low, controlled, but a vein pulsed in his temple. David finally found his voice, hoarse and cracked. "They said not to be late tomorrow. They said all our things." The apartment, once a sanctuary of books and quiet industry, now felt like a trap. The discussion that followed was not a debate. It was a desperate council of war held in whispers. Anna's calm was gone, replaced by a fierce, animal terror. "This is not bureaucracy, Jacob. This is theater of cruelty. They are branding us like cattle. We cannot walk into their square. We hide tonight." Jacob, the rationalist, paced. His logic was a fortress crumbling under artillery fire. "If we disobey the order, they will come for us. They will shoot us here, in this room. If we go, it is a procedure, a resettlement. They want our labor, not our corpses. Everyone is going. The Feldman family, Old Man Levitan, everyone. To not go is to sign a death warrant for certain. And to go is to trust them with our lives." Anna shot back, her eyes blazing. "Look at what they did to a piece of wood. What will they do to us?" David said nothing. He was still in the street, watching the brush descend. His father argued about logistics, transport, the irrationality of killing useful professionals. His mother spoke of cellars, of false walls, of fleeing to the countryside. But David knew. The Black Star was the only truth. It was the future, still wet and ugly. Across the city, in his small workshop, Samuel Karen was also receiving a visitor. Not a uniformed policeman, but a neighbor, Victor, who now wore a brassard on his sleeve. Victor sat on a stool, sipping tea from a chipped cup, complaining about his bad knee. Samuel listened, nodding, his hands busy polishing the brass casing of a mantel clock. They spoke of the plummeting temperature, of the shortage of decent tobacco. It was all unnervingly normal. Then Victor placed his cup down with a soft click. "Samuel, you're a sensible man. You registered, yes?" Samuel paused his polishing. "I did." "Good. That's good. Tomorrow, the square. 10 sharp. Bring your papers, your valuables. Warm clothes." Victor's tone was almost avuncular. "They want things orderly. You know how Germans are. Orderly." He stood, clapping Samuel on the shoulder. "Don't make trouble for yourself. Just be there." After Victor left, the familiar silence of the workshop returned. But it was different now. The ticking of 100 clocks was no longer a chorus of order, but a cacophony of counting down. Samuel looked at his hands, at the tiny gears on his workbench. He could take apart a complex movement and put it back together. He could see how every piece related to another. For the first time in his long life, he looked at the world and could not see the mechanism, only the looming shapeless shadow of the machine. The friendly warning had been more terrifying than any shouted command. The system had him, and it had spoken through a familiar face. Night fell, heavy and absolute. In David's room he sat on the floor, a rag in his hand. He had tried gently at first, then frantically to wipe the paint away. It only smeared, spreading the stain, embedding the symbol deeper into the grain. The violin was ruined. The act was irreversible. He dropped the rag. He pulled the case onto his lap and hugged it, resting his forehead against the cold leather. He did not cry. His eyes were wide open, staring into the dark corner of the room. The last echo of the day's music was gone, obliterated by the memory of bristles on wood. The silence in his head was complete and terrifying. Outside, the rhythmic, unmistakable tread of a German patrol passed by, their boots striking the frozen earth with a mechanical precision that sounded like the beating of a giant, cold heart. Dawn did not break on December 11th. The darkness merely thinned into a grim, slate-colored twilight, as if the sky itself was withholding light. The cold had tightened its grip overnight, frosting windows and turning breath into visible ghosts. The city awoke to a different kind of silence, not of peace, but of held breath. In the Melnikov apartment, the night had been a continuous, silent argument. Jacob and Anna had not slept. They moved around each other like ghosts, packing and unpacking the same few items. A suitcase lay open on their bed, a pitiful monument to a life that needed to be condensed into a single bag. Jacob insisted on medical textbooks, on his stethoscope, tools of his identity. Anna, with frantic practicality, bundled stale bread, hardened chunks of sugar, a small tin of fish. Her hands trembled as she wrapped their wedding photograph in a cloth, then unwrapped it, staring at their younger smiling faces before burying it at the very bottom, as if hiding evidence. Their debate had ended not with resolution, but with exhausted, paralyzing fear. The calculus of terror had no correct answer. To flee was to risk immediate, brutal execution if caught. To go was to step into the unknown, but an unknown everyone else was stepping into. The sight of the violated violin had shattered Anna's spirit, but it had also immobilized her. The will to resist had been replaced by a primal need to stay with her child. Jacob clung to a final frayed thread of professional pride. "They need doctors," he repeated to himself, a secular prayer. "Even now they need doctors." David watched his parents from the doorway. He was already packed. His bag contained little: a change of clothes, the small book of poetry his professor had given him, and the violin. He had closed the case on the defiled instrument, but the smell of paint still leaked out, a constant, nauseating reminder. He felt a strange, hollow detachment. The shock had crystallized into a cold certainty. The act on the street had been a preview, a single brutal note of the symphony to come. He felt older than his father. Across the city, Samuel Karen moved with a deliberate, ceremonial slowness. He dressed in his best suit, threadbare but carefully brushed. He placed his registration papers, his birth certificate proving generations of Crimean roots, into an inner pocket. He looked around his workshop. The clocks ticked, indifferent. He did not pack tools. Instead, he went to a small locked drawer. From it, he took a single old gold pocket watch, his father's. He wound it, held it to his ear, and then slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. Its steady tick against his ribs was the only company he chose to bring. He then methodically began to stop every other clock in the workshop. One by one, the rhythmic ticks ceased, until only the silence and the watch over his heart remained. He was not leaving his life behind. He was formally ending it. On the streets, a sinister osmosis began. From apartments and houses they emerged. At first, singly, like hesitant shadows, then in small family groups, and finally in a steady, quiet stream. They carried suitcases, bundles tied with string, backpacks. They pulled handcarts with blankets and pots. The sight was surreal. A whole segment of the city's soul was on the move, undertaking a grotesque, silent migration. Neighbors glimpsed each other, exchanged brief, haunted looks, then looked away. No words were necessary. The collective shame and fear were a tangible force. The orders had said, valuables. People interpreted this as an insurance policy for their future. Women wore multiple layers of dresses, their bodies swollen with hidden jewelry sewn into hems. Men stuffed currency into the linings of their hats. A woman clutched a silver candelabra as if it were a child. An old man hugged a leather-bound set of Tolstoy. These objects were anchors to their past, ransom for their future, burdens for their present. With every step, the weight of these things grew heavier, both physically and symbolically. The square, the designated gathering point, began to fill. It was not chaos. That was the most chilling part. Auxiliary police, like the ones who had stopped David, were everywhere, directing, gesturing, maintaining a ghastly semblance of order. Over here. Keep moving. Family groups together. Their voices were not angry, but brisk, efficient. The efficiency was more terrifying than rage. It suggested a plan, a vast, impersonal machine into which people were being fed. David, with his parents, melted into the crowd. The sheer scale of it was a shock. Hundreds, then thousands of faces. The young, the old, infants in arms, the sick on makeshift stretchers. He saw his violin professor, Professor Rosen, standing alone, back straight, clutching a small valise. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. The professor gave an almost imperceptible nod, not of reassurance but of recognition, a final acknowledgement of the world they shared. Then the crowd shifted, and he was gone. Anna's hand gripped David's arm so tightly it hurt. She scanned the crowd, not for an escape, but for patterns. She saw the cordon of police. She saw the few German officers observing from the periphery, smoking, talking casually, their eyes scanning the crowd like farmers assessing livestock. She saw there were no buses, no trains waiting, only the open square, filling beyond capacity, and the streets leading out of it, guarded. Her last hope, that this was a logistical mistake, died in her chest. Jacob tried to maintain a facade of professional calm. He pointed out colleagues, muttered about the need for sanitation, for organizing the sick. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted, calculating, finally seeing the trap not as a theory, but as a physical reality of brick uniform and helpless humanity. His hand went to the stethoscope in his bag. The tool felt absurd now, a toy. At the edges, the final acts of cruelty played out in vignettes. A policeman ordered an old woman to open her suitcase. He rummaged through her carefully folded clothes, held up a small icon, sneered, and tossed it back in. The humiliation was public, petty, and designed to break the spirit. A young couple was separated briefly by the press of the crowd. The woman's cry of panic was sharp before they found each other, clinging together. Samuel arrived at the square's edge. He paused, taking in the sea of people. He saw the tension, the silent tears, the children bewildered by the weight. He adjusted his hat, felt the steady tick of his father's watch. He had lived through wars, revolutions, famines. He recognized the architecture of finality. This gathering had none of the chaos of a refugee flight. It had the quiet, awful order of a queue for the abattoir. He did not join the main throng immediately. He stood for a long moment, a still point in the slow current, memorizing the lines of the buildings, the feel of the Crimean winter air, the last free sensations. Then, with a sigh so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself, he stepped forward and allowed the current to take him. The morning dragged on. The cold gnawed through coats. Children whimpered. The initial shock of the crowd morphed into a numb, collective waiting. Rumors, those last desperate children of hope, slithered through the masses. They're processing us for work assignments in Germany. They're sending us to collective farms in the East. They're exchanging us for prisoners of war. People clutched these stories, feeding on them. But the evidence of the eyes argued otherwise. The sheer number of the elderly and infirm, the absence of any transport, the armed guards facing inward, not outward. David felt the violin case dig into his leg. The painted star, invisible inside, felt like it was burning through the leather. He looked at his mother's pale, set face, at his father's crumbling composure. He looked at the thousands around him, a library of lives about to be erased. The music in his head was gone, replaced by a low, dissonant hum of dread, the sound of the machine gearing up. The gathering was complete. The city had emptied one part of itself into this pen. Now there was nothing to do but wait for the machine to engage its next, inevitable gear. The weight of their things, of their past, of their choices, was now absolute. There was no putting the suitcase down. The order did not come with a shout, but as a ripple through the ranks of the auxiliary police. A signal passed from a German officer in a long leather coat to a local commander, then outwards like a cold shockwave. The waiting was over. The machinery of the day engaged with a terrible silent efficiency. The instruction was simple, relayed in flat, raised voices that cut through the murmur of the crowd. Form columns, 5 abreast. Move, keep order. Battens gestured, not striking yet, but pointing with definitive force toward the mouth of the main street, leading east from the square. There was a collective intake of breath, a final, suspended moment, where the entire mass of humanity seemed to teeter on the edge of rebellion or collapse. Then, like a single organism succumbing to gravity, it began to move. The Melnikov family was caught in the slow, grinding current. Jacob instinctively tried to position himself on the outside, placing Anna and David closer to the building line, a futile gesture of protection. Their suitcase, now an alien and cumbersome object, banged against his leg. Anna held David's arm, her fingers like ice. Her eyes were no longer scanning for escape. They were fixed ahead, wide and unblinking, trying to penetrate the unknown that the street promised. David felt the movement as a relief from the paralytic weight. But with each step, the relief curdled into a deeper, more primal dread. They were leaving the center, the familiar geometry of their city. They were being led. The column snaked forward, a grotesque parody of a civic parade. 5,000 souls, then 7, then more, a river of dark coats and pale faces flowing between the blank-faced buildings. The sound was a low symphony of misery, the shuffle of thousands of feet on frozen stone and dirt, the creak of hand-cart wheels, the muffled crying of infants, the occasional sharp call of a policeman to keep pace. There were no voices raised in protest. The sheer scale of the procession, the visible armed perimeter, had extinguished that spark. Resistance was not just dangerous, it was geometrically impossible. They moved through streets they knew. There was the bakery, where Anna used to buy bread before dawn, shuttered now. There was the small park where David played as a child, empty, the benches dusted with frost. There was the clinic where Jacob had practiced. A German flag hung above its door. Each landmark was a stitch ripped from the fabric of their lives, viewed now from the wrong side of a distorting lens. The city was both familiar and utterly alien, a staged set through which they were marching to an unseen finale. The physical burden began to tell. The elderly struggled. A man with a bad leg stumbled, dropping a bundle of clothes. Before he could fully bend to retrieve it, a policeman kicked the bundle into the gutter. "Keep moving!" The man hesitated, a flicker of defiance or despair, then limped on, leaving a piece of his life in the street. A woman dragging a heavy trunk finally collapsed over it, sobbing. Her family tried to pull her up, to lift the trunk, but the column pressed around them, a relentless tide. 2 policemen moved in, not to help, but to dislodge the obstruction. They yanked the woman to her feet and shoved the trunk off the road. The message was clear. Your past is a hindrance. Shed it or be trampled. Samuel Karen walked near the middle of the column. He moved with a steady old man's pace, his back straight, his eyes not on the backs before him, but on the upper stories of the buildings, on the slice of gray sky above. He was not carrying his life in a bag. He was carrying it within him. The tick of the watch was a metronome, marking this last strange journey. He saw the discarded objects along the route: a broken doll, a spilled suitcase, a single good shoe, like debris left by a retreating army. But they were not retreating. They were being marched forward. He thought of historical narratives, of exiles and forced marches. He understood now that those were not just stories. They were instructions manuals for despair, written in real time on the cobblestones. For David, the march became a disassociative nightmare. The violin case in his hand was no longer an instrument case. It was a weight, an artifact from a dead civilization. The smell of paint merged with the smell of cold sweat and damp wool. He watched the back of the man in front of him, the frayed collar of an overcoat, a patch of bare scalp. He counted steps: 20, 50, 100. He tried to hum a scale in his head, but the rhythm was broken by the irregular shuffle of feet, by a sudden jostle. His connection to his body, to the street, to his parents beside him, grew thin. He was a ghost already, haunting his own last footsteps. The outskirts of the city approached. The buildings grew lower, more spaced out. Workshops, warehouses, the industrial fringe. The air changed, carrying a hint of coal smoke and something else, something dank and earthy. The paved street gave way to a rutted, frozen dirt road. This was not the way to a train station. This was not the way to anything that promised a future. A low whisper, the last child of hope, died in the column. The reality was now a physical path they were walking, leading away from everything and toward nothing. Anna's rational mind, the doctor who diagnosed cause and effect, finally made the final terrible diagnosis. No transport, no processing facilities. A march to the empty edge of the city. The cold equations solved themselves in her mind. She stumbled, and Jacob caught her elbow. She looked at him, and in that look, she communicated everything the words could not bear. This is not resettlement. This is an end. Jacob saw it in her eyes. The last vestige of his professional privilege, his belief in his own necessary utility, crumbled to dust. The stethoscope in his bag was now merely a piece of tubing. At the head of the endless column, the destination came into view. A complex of low brick factory buildings with tall chimneys. A sign, partly obscured, Bummash, and beyond it, open, empty fields scarred by raw earth. From this distance they could see figures moving, not civilians but more uniforms, and the dark shapes of trucks. The geometry of the operation revealed itself. The factory was not their destination. It was a holding pen. The fields beyond were the stage. The pace of the police at the front did not slow. They directed the head of the column off the road, through an open gate in a wire fence, toward the vast, impersonal bulk of the factory. The river of people began to pour into this new container. The silence from the marchers deepened, becoming a thick, suffocating blanket of comprehension. The journey from their homes, through their city, had been the longest possible road to a very short, sharp conclusion. David, entering the factory grounds, looked back for one fleeting second. He could still see the distant spire of the city center, a ghostly gray shape in the winter haze. It was the last time he would see it. He turned his face forward, toward the looming brick walls. The music was gone. All that remained was the echo of the march, the memory of his own footsteps, now leading him into the mouth of the machine. The factory grounds of Bummash were a kingdom of shadow and rust, a sprawling, broken maze of industry that had fallen silent. The column did not enter a building immediately. It was funneled into a vast concrete yard, hemmed in on all sides by the soot-stained brick fortresses of workshops and storage sheds. The sky, a narrow strip of bruised gray above the roof lines, seemed to recede, closing the lid on the world. The first shock was the scale of the congregation. Thousands were already there, pressed together, a dense, shivering mass of humanity that filled every inch of the open space. The newcomers from the city were absorbed into this larger pool, pushing the boundaries of the crowd tighter against the cold brick walls. The air grew thick with the smell of fear, of damp wool, of unwashed bodies, and underneath it all, the faint, acrid scent of machine oil and stale combustion. Order dissolved into a controlled, nightmarish chaos. The brisk efficiency of the march gave way to a more brutal, impatient handling. Auxiliary police and now German soldiers, their uniforms darker and more severe, moved along the edges of the crowd, shouting contradictory orders. Stay in family groups. Separate men from women. Move to the left. No, to the right. The confusion was weaponized, a tactic to shatter the last remnants of social cohesion, to reduce people from families and individuals to a manageable, panicked herd. The Melnikov family clung together, a tiny island in a raging sea of bodies. Jacob used his height and his suitcase as a buffer, trying to shield Anna and David from the worst of the crushing pressure. Anna's clinical eye took in the horrifying details. The elderly slumped on their bundles, their breath ragged, mothers trying to quiet screaming children with empty hands, a man having a silent, wide-eyed panic attack, his mouth open in a soundless scream. She saw no water, no sanitation, no food. This was not a transit point. This was a holding tank. David felt the press of strangers on all sides. The violin case was crushed against his chest, the shape of it digging into his ribs. He could hear 100 different sounds, coughing, praying in hushed, frantic tones, the guttural commands of the guards, all blending into a monstrous, dissonant choir. He closed his eyes, trying to find a silent space inside his own head, but the physical reality was too overwhelming. The cold seeped up from the concrete through the soles of his shoes, a creeping numbness that matched the feeling in his soul. Through the crowd, he caught a glimpse of Professor Rosen. The old man was standing perfectly still, his valise at his feet, his gaze fixed on something distant and internal, as if he were listening to a far-off piece of music only he could hear. The sight was a pinprick of strange calm in the chaos. Then a shove from behind broke his line of sight, and the professor was gone. From the main factory building, large sliding doors groaned open. The orders became more specific, more urgent. Into the shops, move, everyone inside, faster. The crowd began to lurch forward, funneling toward the dark maw of the open doors. There was no choice. The pressure from behind was inexorable. They were being packed into the belly of the beast. The interior was a cavern of gloom and echoing noise. It was a machine shop, long idle. The skeletal remains of lathes and drill presses stood like silent metal sentinels in the half-light. High, grimy windows let in slivers of the dying day. The air was frigid, colder than outside, and heavy with the ghost of metal shavings and grease. People poured in, filling the empty spaces between the machinery, sitting on the oily floor, leaning against cold iron. Finding a space was a desperate, undignified scramble. The Melnikovs ended up near a wall, beneath a dangling chain hoist. They sat, huddled together, their backs against the bricks. The reality of their situation settled upon them, with the weight of the iron all around. There was no talking of plans now, no debate. The walls and the armed men at the doors were the only facts that mattered. As dusk began to stain the windows a deeper gray, a new procedure began. Squads of guards, accompanied by civilians with clipboards, moved systematically through the packed crowd in the yard and then into the workshops. It was a final inventory. They moved from group to group, their flashlights cutting beams through the gloom. Valuables, jewelry, money, watches. Place them here, for safekeeping. For the journey. The demand was delivered not with a snarl, but with a bored, administrative finality. It was the last, definitive transaction. Some people resisted for a moment, clutching a wedding ring, hiding a wallet. A flashlight beam would fix on their face. A guard's hand would rest on his baton. The silence that followed was more persuasive than any threat. Slowly, with trembling hands, people complied. Piles of watches, rings, necklaces, and crumpled banknotes grew on the blankets spread by the collectors. The metallic clinks and the rustle of paper were the only sounds in the vast, cold space. It was not a robbery, it was a ritual stripping, the systematic removal of identity and history, converted into anonymous loot. Samuel Karen watched the collector approach. The man held out a canvas bag. Samuel felt the weight of his father's watch in his waistcoat pocket. Its steady ticking was a private heartbeat against the silence of the stopped clocks he had left behind. He did not hesitate. He reached in, felt the warm metal, and pulled it out. For a moment he held it in his palm, feeling its perfect, familiar weight. Then, with a calm, deliberate motion, he placed it in the bag. He did not look at the collector's face. He looked at the watch until it disappeared into the darkness of the sack. He felt no anger, only a profound, empty completion. Every tie was now severed. In the deepening dark of the machine shop, families began to prepare for a night that everyone sensed was different from all other nights. They shared the last of their hidden food, a crust of bread, a piece of hardened cheese. They whispered reassurances to children that rang hollow even to their own ears. They tried to sleep, but the cold and the fear were like needles on the skin. David, sitting between his parents, finally opened the violin case. In the near darkness, the black star was a vague, darker shadow on the wood. He did not take the instrument out. He simply looked at it. He thought not of music, but of the policeman's hand holding the brush. He thought of the deliberate, unhurried stroke. That was the key. None of this was an accident or an outburst of rage. It was all as deliberate as that stroke. The registration, the march, this factory, the collection of valuables. Each step was a calculated move in a game whose final move he could not see, but whose malevolent pattern he now felt in his bones. He closed the case. He leaned his head against his mother's shoulder. She put her arm around him, a gesture from a world that no longer existed. Outside, in the yard, the beams of flashlights continued to cut through the night. The silhouette of a German officer could be seen on a gantry, observing the quiet, packed human reservoir below. He consulted a clipboard, then looked toward the black fields beyond the factory perimeter. Everything was proceeding. The factory was not a refuge. It was a compression chamber. And the pressure was building toward a single, unthinkable release. The night inside the Bummash machine shop was a living entity, a vast, shared exhalation of dread that thickened the cold air. It was not a time of rest, but of suspended animation. Thousands of people crammed in the dark, trying to shrink into themselves, to become smaller targets for the fate that hovered just beyond the walls. The silence was porous, pierced by the coughs that echoed like gunshots, by the muffled sobs of children too exhausted to cry fully, by the low, frantic murmur of prayers in multiple languages, weaving together into a hopeless tapestry of supplication. David did not sleep. A hyper-alert numbness held him. His back ached against the brick wall, his mother's weight leaning into one side, his father's rigid presence on the other. The cold from the concrete floor seeped up, a slow poison. He listened to the sounds of the factory at night. not the human sounds, but the building itself. The groan of a metal roof beam contracting in the deep freeze, the skitter of a rat in a distant corner, the faint, almost imperceptible hum of something electrical, perhaps a generator powering lights somewhere else in the command posts. These sounds were the heartbeat of the mechanism that now contained them. He imagined the factory as a giant sleeping machine, and they were the raw material fed into its hopper, waiting for the main power to be thrown. Anna existed in a state of heightened medical awareness. Her mind, trained to diagnose, compulsively assessed the deteriorating vital signs of the multitude. She heard the wet, ragged breathing of pneumonia in an old man a few meters away. She saw the glazed eyes of shock in a young mother clutching a listless infant. She felt the collective body heat failing against the industrial chill. This was a ward of the doomed, and she was a doctor, without medicine, without instruments, without hope. Her husband's stethoscope in the bag beside her was a fossil from a lost civilization. She focused on David's breathing, using its rhythm as an anchor to keep from screaming. Jacob's rationality had finally shattered. It lay in shards, cutting him from the inside. Every axiom of his life, that skill mattered, that order prevailed, that civilization had a floor below which it could not sink, had been proven false. He stared into the darkness, seeing not the present, but flashbacks to his clinic. A child's trusting smile, an old woman's gratitude. These memories were now taunts, evidence of a profound personal foolishness. He had believed in the system, even this brutal new one, to value his function. Now he understood he had no function. He was merely a unit, occupying a specific, calculable amount of space. The thought was so vacuous it threatened to unravel his mind. Outside, in the administrative heart of the nightmare, the mechanism operated with chilling clarity. In a heated office, lit by harsh electric bulbs, a world away from the dark shop floor, maps were spread on desks. The maps showed the factory complex, the surrounding fields, and the distinct, long, narrow gash of the anti-tank ditch dug years before. It was marked with precise technical notations. German officers, their uniforms neat, spoke in low professional tones. They discussed timetables, troop rotations, logistical bottlenecks. The language was of engineering, of throughput. Phrases like processing speed, personnel allocation, and site security were used. A coffee pot steamed on a stove. It was a planning session for a municipal project, devoid of any reference to the human content of the operation. The cold was kept outside. The moral universe was kept even further at bay. Samuel Karen sat apart from the main family clusters, near the base of a silent vertical drill. He was not praying. He was remembering. Not in a flood of sentiment, but with the precision of a craftsman recalling a complex blueprint. The taste of the fish his wife used to make. The specific grain of the olive wood he used for his first clock case. The sound of the sea at Yalta on a windy afternoon. He reconstructed these sensations detail by detail, as if performing a final inventory of a rich and finished life. The stripping of his watch had been a liberation. He was no longer a man with possessions to lose. He was a repository of memories, and they could not take those. Not yet. He felt a strange, serene detachment. He was observing the end from a slight, unbridgeable distance. As the deepest hour of the night passed, a new sound intruded upon the collective misery. From beyond the walls, from the direction of the open fields, came the growl of heavy engines. Not the intermittent sounds of patrol trucks, but the deep, diesel-throated churn of large, idling vehicles. The sound would rise, then fade, then rise again, a persistent, mechanical beast lurking just out of sight. People stirred, lifting their heads. Whispers flared and died. No one needed to ask what the engines were for. In the grammar of their new world, heavy engines in the dead of night never meant rescue. Then the lights came on. Not the dim, ghostly light from the high windows, but stark, blinding electric arcs. Large mobile lamps were being positioned outside, their beams slashing through cracks in the shutters, painting moving bars of savage white light across the terrified faces inside the shop. The light was an assault. It signaled the end of the waiting. The machine was powering up. A wave of visceral terror passed through the thousands packed in the space. It was a physical tremor, a collective shudder. Children, sensing the primal fear of the adults, began to cry in earnest. The prayers grew louder, more desperate. The polite fiction of resettlement had evaporated in the glare of those lights. The terrible, unspoken understanding now solidified into a knowledge that sat in the stomach like a stone. David watched a bar of light sweep across his father's face. Jacob's eyes were wide, uncomprehending, finally stripped of all pretense of understanding. He looked like a patient seeing his own terminal diagnosis written on an X-ray. Anna's grip on David's hand became vice-like, a communication of pure animal panic. The last barrier between hope and despair was the brick wall at their backs, and it offered no escape. The interior doors of the shop crashed open, not the large rolling doors to the yard, but a smaller personnel door. In the frame stood the silhouettes of several auxiliary police and a German NCO. The German held a clipboard. He did not shout. His voice, when it came, was flat and carried the weight of pure authority in the sudden silence. Prepare to move. You will form columns outside. Proceed in an orderly fashion. Bring your remaining hand luggage. The words were a formality, a final, cruel parody of procedure. The mechanism had reached the point of execution. The raw material was to be conveyed from storage to the processing point. The diesel engines outside revved, a deafening response to the command. The night was over. The darkest part of the day was beginning. The flat command from the doorway did not spark movement. For a long, breathless moment, the thousands in the machine shop remained frozen, a single organism seized by paralysis. The brutal white light from outside cut through the room, exposing every detail of grimy fear on their faces. Then, like a great machine engaging its first gear, the outer edges of the crowd began to stir, pushed forward by the inevitable pressure of guards moving in from the perimeter. The movement was not a walk. It was a slow, viscous flow of humanity, squeezed through the bottleneck of the doors into the blinding, electric-lit yard. The cold of the deep night hit like a physical blow, a sharp, clean agony after the stale chill of the factory. The air was no longer still. It vibrated with the diesel roar of unseen engines, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The yard had been transformed into a stage of stark, horrific theater. Giant mobile lamps on tripods were positioned at intervals, their beams crossing in the air, creating pools of blinding light and deep, impenetrable shadow. The light did not illuminate, it interrogated. It stripped people of their last shadows to hide in. In the center of this artificial dawn, a new selection had been arranged. It was not the selection from the cattle cars of Auschwitz. There were no doctors, no gestures of life or death. This was a final, brutal triage of property and identity. 2 lines were formed by a corridor of guards with linked arms. At the head of each line stood tables. Behind one table sat a civilian clerk with ledgers. Behind the other, soldiers stood over empty crates. The process was simple, mechanical, and dehumanizing in its efficiency. As each person or family group reached the head of the line, they were split. Men were directed one way, women and children another. A final, physical severing of the most basic human bonds. All remaining luggage, bags, parcels, here, now. The order allowed no hesitation. The last physical remnants of home, the small suitcase with a change of clothes, the bundle with family photos, the sack with a loaf of bread, were torn from numb hands and tossed into the crates, where they landed with soft, final thuds. This was the last theft, the harvest of the final pathetic crop. People stumbled forward, suddenly weightless, unmoored from every tangible anchor to their past. Next came the civilian clerk. He did not look at faces. He looked at documents. Papers, identity cards, registration documents. Fingers, stiff with cold and terror, fumbled to produce the folded, cherished papers that proved their existence, their right to be. The clerk took them, gave them a cursory glance, and then, with a bored, practiced motion, he ripped them in half. The sound, a sharp, dry tear, was tiny, but catastrophic. He dropped the halves into a growing pile at his feet. Rip, drop, rip, drop. It was the sound of identities being canceled, of lives being officially voided. A man ahead of Jacob stared at his torn birth certificate in the clerk's hand, his mouth working soundlessly, as if the act had severed his vocal cords. David, separated now from his mother in the women's line, watched as his father reached the table. He saw Jacob's shoulders slump as the doctor's last book was taken from his bag and thrown aside. He saw the clerk take Jacob's internal passport, the document that defined him as a physician, a citizen, a man. The rip was audible even over the engines. Jacob flinched as if struck. He was pushed forward, a shell now, empty of everything but the clothes on his back and the stethoscope, still, absurdly, around his neck. Then it was David's turn. He clutched only the violin case. A guard gestured impatiently at it. David's arms locked. For a second, a final, stupid spark of defiance flared. This was all he had left. The guard's expression shifted from boredom to menace. He took a step forward. David's body acted before his mind could. He thrust the case forward. The guard snatched it, popped the latches, looked inside at the violated instrument with its black star. He sneered, snapped it shut, and tossed it onto a pile of other broken things. It landed with a hollow wooden crunch. The sound was the death of David's future. He felt nothing, a profound, absolute emptiness. He was shoved toward the clerk. He had no documents left. They were with his parents. The clerk looked up, annoyed by the delay. "Name?" he barked. David whispered it. The clerk made a mark in his ledger, a tick next to a number. That was all he was now. A tick. A mark. He was pushed past the table, into the holding pen of men who had been processed. Here, in this roped-off section of the yard, the men stood exposed. The cruel genius of the operation revealed itself fully. Stripped of belongings, stripped of papers, separated from their families, they were no longer fathers, sons, husbands, craftsmen, doctors. They were units, interchangeable, disoriented. Their social architecture had been systematically demolished in under 3 minutes. They huddled together not for comfort, but because they were herded, their eyes darting, searching for their wives, their children in the parallel pen across the yard. Samuel Karen moved through this last station with the calm of a man walking into a familiar room. He had nothing to give but his name. When the clerk ripped a meaningless receipt he had kept, Samuel watched the pieces fall without a flicker in his eyes. He had already performed his own rituals of leaving. This was merely bureaucracy catching up. He joined the other men, his posture erect, his gaze clear. He saw the younger men crumbling, their spirits broken by the systematic demolition. He felt a distant, grandfatherly pity. They had not had his time to prepare. From the women's line, a sudden, piercing wail cut through the mechanical din. A young woman had refused to be separated from her teenage son, clinging to him. 2 guards descended on her, pulling her back, striking her hands with batons until she released her grip. The boy, his face a mask of terror, was propelled into the men's pen. The woman collapsed, her cries devolving into ragged, hopeless screams until she was dragged away. The violence was quick, specific, and instructional. It demonstrated the cost of resistance. It showed that the mechanism had teeth, and it would not hesitate to use them. The lines continued to feed, an endless conveyor belt of finality. The piles of ripped paper grew into small hills. The crates filled with the last pathetic treasures of a people. The 2 pens swelled. The guards at the perimeter watched with blank faces, their weapons held not in threat, but in readiness. The atmosphere had changed from one of terrified waiting to one of eerie, grim completion. A job was being done, and it was nearly done. David, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, looked across the electric-lit void at the women's pen. He scanned the faces, a blur of pale ovals under shawls and scarves. Then he found her. His mother. She was standing perfectly still, her eyes searching frantically, their gazes locked. Across the noise, the light, the impossible distance, a connection snapped into place. Anna's face, which had been contorted with fear, softened for a microsecond into an expression of pure, agonizing love. It was a look that contained his entire childhood, every scrap of safety he had ever known. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a farewell. It was an imprint, a last transmission of her soul into his. Then a guard moved between them, blocking the sight line. When he passed, David's eyes darted, but he could not find her again in the shifting crowd. The moment was gone, severed as cleanly as the papers. But the imprint remained, a searing after-image on his heart. He was no longer a tick in a ledger. He was, for one more moment, his mother's son. It was the last thing they would give him, and the only thing they could not take away. The mechanism had processed everything except that final, silent look. The processed groups did not wait long in their pens. The final, terrible geometry of the plan required motion, a continuous flow to prevent stagnation, thought, or the crystallization of despair into action. A sharp whistle blew, different from the previous commands, shorter, more urgent. The guards along the perimeter of the men's pen stepped back, creating an opening that pointed not back toward the factory, but away from it, into the profound darkness beyond the reach of the arc lamps. The first ranks of men hesitated, peering into the black maw of the night. The space ahead was undefined, a void. Then a prod came, not a shove, but the forward press of the hundreds behind them, a human current with no possibility of reverse flow. The first men stepped out of the pool of light and the darkness swallowed them whole. David was in the middle of the group. The transition from blinding electric glare to utter blackness was a physical shock, a temporary blindness. His eyes strained, desperate for reference. The ground underfoot changed from the packed concrete of the yard to frozen, rutted earth, littered with sharp stones and tufts of dead grass. The cold was deeper here, untouched by the lamps or the mass of bodies. It was the raw cold of an open field in December. As his vision adjusted, shapes emerged from the gloom. He could see the silhouettes of the men ahead, a shifting, shadowy column against a slightly less black horizon. He could hear their progress, the crunch of frost, the stumble, the muffled gasp. And he could hear the new sound. It was a sound that had been buried under the diesel growl before, but now in the open, it dominated. It was a low, constant, murmuring rush, like a distant waterfall or a monstrous, resting beast breathing. It came from ahead and to the right. It was the sound of many voices, thousands of voices, blended into a single dissonant chord of anguish. It was the sound of the women's column moving on a parallel path through the night, separated by an invisible guarded divide. Walking into that darkness was like walking off the edge of a known world. Every step away from the factory was a step into a geographical and existential nothingness. The mind, severed from all its anchors, home, possessions, family, documents, began to fray at the edges. Some men began to whisper names into the dark. Sarah? Moshe. The whispers were not calls, but incantations, attempts to summon a reality that was gone. Others walked in a silent, mechanical trance, their bodies moving, while their minds had already departed. David's senses heightened to an animal level. He felt the texture of the frozen clods breaking under his shoes. He smelled the iron scent of frost and the distant cold smell of damp soil from the unseen ditch. He listened to the horrifying choir of the parallel column, hearing within it the distinct, shattered cry of a child, abruptly cut off. His body was a receiver tuned to a station broadcasting pure terror. The column began to slow, to compress. The men in front were stopping, not by choice, but because the way forward was being blocked. A new, closer sound introduced itself, a sound of engines, not rumbling from a distance, but idling nearby, their exhaust fumes a bitter tang in the air. Dark, hulking shapes of trucks materialized at the periphery of vision, their outlines blotting out parts of the starless sky. And then David saw the edge. It was not a cliff. It was a long, linear absence in the earth, the anti-tank ditch. From where he stood, it was a deeper patch of blackness, a tear in the fabric of the ground. It seemed to go on forever in both directions. As his eyes adjusted further, he could make out its scale. It was deep. Its far side was a vague, raw wall of earth. Its near side sloped down into blackness. And it was not silent. The murmuring rush of the parallel column was now joined by other sounds that rose from that gash in the earth. Not voices, not screams, but sounds of movement. A vast, sluggish, liquid shifting, a soft, collective sigh. That was the sound of thousands of people already standing, waiting, packed into a deep, cold trench. They had been led here, first. The ditch was already full. He was not walking toward an empty pit. He was walking toward a filled grave, and he was to be the next layer. The column of men was being directed along the lip of the ditch. Guards with flashlights stood every 20 meters, their beams cutting brief, stark paths through the dark, illuminating frozen faces, then plunging them back into oblivion. The beams did not point into the ditch. They pointed along the path, keeping the flow moving to its designated starting point. David, pushed forward by the momentum, found himself at the edge. He could not stop. He looked down. The flashlight beams from the guards above occasionally swept across the trench, never lingering but providing horrific, stroboscopic glimpses. He saw a sea of upturned faces, pale moons in the dark. He saw people standing so tightly packed they could not move their arms. He saw children sitting on shoulders. He saw the vapor of 10,000 breaths rising in a faint, doomed mist over the trench. He saw eyes, wide, uncomprehending, waiting. The ditch was not just a geographic feature. It was a container for a single, massive, living organism of despair. A new command passed down the line of guards, not shouted, but spoken with cold urgency. Coats. Remove your outer coats. Now. Drop them. It made no sense. The cold was lethal. To remove a coat was to invite death by exposure. But the order was enforced with immediate violence. A man near David refused, clutching his coat around him. A guard stepped forward and struck him across the face with a rifle butt. The man crumpled, and his coat was ripped from him. The message was clear. The mechanism had a reason. Obey. Hands numb with more than cold fumbled with buttons and belts. Heavy winter coats, the last barrier against the elements, were shed and dropped onto the growing pile by the path. Men stood in shirts and sweaters, their bodies instantly racked with violent, uncontrollable shivers. The cold became a razor, cutting through cloth and skin to the bone. The act of disrobing was the final surrender, the acceptance of a fate where warmth, comfort, and survival were no longer relevant concepts. David let his thin jacket fall. The night air seized him, a shock so profound it stole his breath. He looked again into the ditch. The people below were also in their lighter clothes. They had gone through this already. This was the procedure. This was the preparation. He was at the head of the column now. A guard pointed with a flashlight, not down into the mass of people, but to a specific spot, where the near side of the ditch had been worn into a crude, muddy slope by thousands of descending feet. A path into the pit. There was no pause. There was no final moment of decision. The pressure from behind was absolute. David took one last look at the world above the ditch, the black sky, the distant, indifferent silhouette of the factory, the cold stars beginning to show through a break in the clouds. Then his foot slipped on the frozen mud of the slope, and he began his descent into the roaring, breathing, living darkness below. The descent into the anti-tank ditch was not a step, but a fall into a different dimension of reality. The frozen mud of the slope gave way under David's feet, and he slid the last few meters, crashing into the packed, shuddering mass of humanity already filling the trench. The impact was soft and horrible, a yielding wall of cold bodies, trembling with a collective seismic shiver. The air here was thick, solid, a soup of frozen breath, sweat, and the damp, mineral smell of raw earth. He was immediately immobilized, pressed on all sides. There was no room to lift his arms, no space to turn his head more than a few degrees. He was a brick in a living wall. The cold from the earth walls seeped into him from all directions, a pervasive, draining chill that felt ancient and final. The sound was overwhelming, a low, constant roar composed of thousands of whispers, prayers, weeping, the shallow, rapid breathing of panic, and the helpless crying of children. It was the sound of a heart beating its last, frantic rhythms. He was surrounded by strangers, their faces inches from his, their breath mingling in a ghostly cloud. To his left, an old man muttered the same phrase from the Psalms over and over, his eyes closed, tears freezing on his wrinkled cheeks. To his right, a young man, his face a mask of fury and terror, strained against the press, muscles corded in his neck. But there was nowhere to go. The pressure was constant, ebbing and flowing in waves as more and more people were fed into the trench from above, each new arrival compressing those already there a degree further. David's mind, which had been stretched thin by the long march and the blinding lights, now focused with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. He thought of the violin, not with sorrow but with a bizarre technical detachment. The black star painted on it was not a symbol anymore. It was a target. And they were all now inside that target. He thought of his mother's last look across the yard, the searing imprint of love. That was real. This, the crushing physicality of the ditch, was the unreal thing. This was the nightmare his conscious mind was constructing as it shut down. He tried to find a sight line upward. Through the forest of heads and shoulders, he could see a narrow strip of dark, star-pricked sky. The lip of the ditch was a black cutout against it. And then, shapes appeared along that lip. Silhouettes. Not the slouched outlines of the auxiliary police, but the distinct, helmeted profiles of soldiers. They spaced themselves at regular intervals, looking down into the seething trench. They did not move. They simply stood, a dark, motionless frieze against the sky. Their stillness was more threatening than any gesture. From somewhere deeper in the trench, a voice rose above the din, not in prayer, but in a raw, powerful burst of song. It was a fragment of an old folk song, a melody of the earth and the sea. For a few bars, it hung in the frozen air, beautiful and defiant. Then it was swallowed by a surge of weeping. But for a moment it had been there, a pinprick of humanity in the dark. Then a new sound, mechanical, precise. From above, along the line of silhouettes, came the distinctive, metallic clack-clack of bolts being worked on rifles. The sound was not loud, but it cut through the human noise with the clarity of a scalpel. A wave of understanding passed through the trench, a physical contraction of 12,000 souls. The murmuring did not rise. It died. It fell into a profound, bottomless silence, broken only by the isolated hysterical sob that was quickly stifled. In that silence, David heard his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He heard the old man next to him stop his psalm mid-word. He heard the frozen mud crumble from the wall beside him. Time distended, stretched to the point of snapping. He was no longer cold. A final, desperate surge of chemicals flooded his system, sharpening every sense to an unbearable point. He saw in his mind's eye, not the past, but the impossible future he had once dreamed. The conservatory stage, the feel of the unvarnished wood of a violin's neck under his chin, the first pull of the bow across the string, the birth of a pure, clean note. It was not a memory. It was a creation, a perfect, silent concert, performed in the private theater of his dying mind. The note sustained, held, flawless. A flashlight beam swept across the trench from above, a final cursory inspection. A voice, German, calm, devoid of any emotion beyond mundane command, called out a single word into the night. The world did not end with a bang. It ended with a cacophony of them, a deafening, erupting wall of sound that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. But David did not hear it. He was still holding that first, perfect note of his concerto, a sound so vivid and whole it rendered all others obsolete. The note was everything. It was the shape of his mother's face. It was the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder. It was the ticking of a gold watch in a dark workshop. It was the last, unbreakable thought of a mind that chose, in its final microsecond, to create rather than to fear. The sound of the mechanisms of death was vast, clinical, and complete. It filled the crater, echoed off the factory walls, and rolled out over the sleeping, complicit countryside. It was the sound of a task being accomplished, of a quota being met, of a problem being solved. And then there was a different silence. Not the waiting silence of before, but a thick, heavy, absolute silence. A silence that absorbed everything, the echoes, the memory of the cries, the ghost of the defiant song. It was the silence of a void where life had just been, a deafening absence. High above, on the lip of the ditch, the silhouettes moved. Flashlights clicked on again, their beams now probing, practical. Voices spoke, normal tones now, discussing the next phase. The logistics of burial, the need for the next shift to be brought. The engineering of oblivion had moved from the active to the passive phase. The mechanism had performed its function. Below, in the deep scar in the earth, the silence settled, dense and permanent, under the cold Crimean stars. The only sound left was the wind, beginning to whistle softly, through the new, terrible geometry of the place, as if learning a new tune.